or sweatpants. And that woman came running from the bushes in the darkness toward the gate where the call box was, and she was yelling something. She was shouting something. Do you remember what she was shouting? Remember what the testimony was in this case? She was shouting, "He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me." And she shouted this 4 or 5 times as she arrived at that button and began pushing that button to get out of that gate, to get off that property, to get out of his house. And as Officer Edwards stood there on the street side, on the Rockingham side of that gate, looking at her on the opposite side of the gate, what did he see? He saw that she was covered with mud. She was panicked. As Officer Edwards put it, she was hysterical. And she's hitting that button, trying to open that gate to get out of there, and she's yelling to him, "He's going to kill me." And what did Officer Edwards say? What did he say? Who? Who's going to kill you? He didn't see anybody running behind her. Who? Who is going to kill you? And what did she say? OJ. OJ. OJ Simpson. The gate finally opened. And she ran through the gate, and she ran to Officer Edwards. And she fell in his arms and collapsed. And she said, "He's going to kill me." And she just kept repeating it. Well, at that point, Officer Edwards shined his flashlight on her face. You remember the testimony? When he shined that flashlight on her face, he saw that her eye was starting to blacken. The right side of her forehead was swollen. There was an imprint with some sort of a swollen mark on her right cheek. Cheek, did I say? And he also said that she had a handprint. He saw a handprint on the left side of her neck, on the left side of her throat. A handprint. Someone had grabbed this woman, his wife, by the neck, hard enough to leave an imprint around her neck, an imprint in the shape of his hand. Let me say this to you. We submit to you that the hand that left that imprint 5 years ago is the same hand that cut that same throat, that same neck on June 12, 1994. It was the defendant. It was the defendant then, it's the defendant now. And at that point, Nicole Brown she said a series of things to Officer Edwards. And remember, keep in mind that she was hysterical, she was upset, and she was panicked, and I'm sure that she was in fear, because she must have been in fear, because she was riding through the night covered with mud in a bra and in her pajamas. And she said to Officer Edwards, she said something very important to Officer Edwards. She said, "You never do anything about him. You come out here, you've been out here 8 times, and you never do anything about him." That's what she told Officer Edwards that day. She said, "You've been out here 8 times. They want to tell you that the police conspired against O.J. Simpson." Nicole says they'd been out there 8 times before and never did anything to him. I don't know. But let me ask you this. How many times does it take? If they'd been out there 8 times before that night, then that night was the 9th time. No one had ever done anything to him before. I don't know why that is. But what do you think? You think it's time that, think that perhaps this time we ought to do something? 8 is enough. If 8 isn't enough, 9 is certainly enough. Nicole said it with her own mouth back then. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. And sure enough, he has. Well, after she makes these spontaneous statements to Officer Edwards, after she complains that they've been out there 8 times before and they've never done anything to him, this man, the defendant, see, and we're seeing the defendant at home at this point, okay? We're seeing that private side of him, that private side that I told you I'd show you. He comes out of his house and he's wearing a bathrobe. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, nothing wrong with that. And he speaks to Officer Edwards. Now, when he speaks to Officer Edwards, does he ask him, how's my wife? No. Does he say, I hope I didn't hurt her too badly? No. What does he say? What does he do? He humiliates her. Remember what he said? He said, I don't want that woman in my bed anymore. I got 2 other women. I don't want that woman in my bed anymore. That was his response. And this was Nicola's wife. She'd been his wife 4 years. And you recall Officer Edwards' testimony that this defendant, he was angry. He was mad. He was fit to be tied. And he was yelling at Officer Edwards. And the defendant was on one side of the gate. He was on the Rockingham side, on his own property. Officer Edwards was on the other side of the gate. And there they are, speaking to each other on opposite sides of the gate. And the defendant is yelling these things to Officer Edwards about his wife, saying these kinds of things about his wife to Officer Edwards, who is a stranger. And Officer Edwards said to the defendant, your wife has been battered. She is injured. I'm going to have to arrest you. Well, that just set the defendant off again, just set him off. Let me tell you something, the fuse is burning. The fuse is burning, folks. The fuse is burning. And at some point, this fuse is going to run out. It's going to play out. It's going to get so short that and so close to the bomb that at some point this bomb is going to explode. And what does the defendant say when Officer Edwards says to him, I'm going to have to arrest you. I'm going to have to take you to jail. What does the defendant say? He says the same thing Nicole said, in a sense. He says to Officer Edwards, this is what the defendant said. You recall his testimony. Officer Edwards heard the defendant say, you've been up here 8 times before, and now you're going to arrest me for this? Now, let's just think about that for a moment. If nothing else, we now have the confirmation that we need. That is the confirmation of the fact that the police have been there 8 times before. But what is this part about? And now you're going to arrest me for this. What does that mean? What does that mean? Now you're going to arrest me for this. But you've been up here 8 times before, and I don't know. I mean, this is the evidence in the case. You're going to have to decide what that means. You can interpret what he says. You don't have to just take it literally. You decide what that means. It can mean a couple of things. And after he said that, and after he complained to Officer Edwards about the fact that he's going to be arrested for beating his wife, he says to Officer Edwards, this is a family matter. It's a family matter and nothing more. Well, wife beating is not just a family matter. Is it? I mean, is this something we ought to take seriously? That's one thing about spousal abuse. You know what happens. And it always happens behind closed doors. And you know what they say, nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors. And we don't know everything that went on behind the gates of this man's estate at Rockingham. But we do know this, that whatever it was, whatever went on there had gone on 8 times prior to this time. Right? We know that. But he says it's a family matter. He minimizes what has happened. He doesn't care about this woman. He doesn't care about what he did to her. Well, Officer Edwards gives him the star treatment. He tells him, hey, I'm going to take you to jail. Go back in the house and get dressed. Well, Officer Edwards did not insist on arresting him right then and there, and at that point, he let him go in the house alone to get dressed. And apparently that's what the defendant did, because a few minutes later, he came back out, yelling and complaining and moaning, complaining about being arrested and saying more derogatory things about his wife in front of this stranger. Well, in the meantime, Officer Edwards had sent for a second car, a second police vehicle, a transport vehicle, because he was going to transport Nicole to the station in one car, and they were going to arrest this man and take him to the station in another car. And as that second police car arrived, and as Officer Edwards turned his attention toward that second police car, that meant that he turned his attention away from the defendant. And what did the defendant do? Remember the testimony? You remember what happened? I know it's been a long time. What did he do? Jumped in the car and he ran. Remember that? He went out the other gate. In the Bentley, he ran. He drove away. He got away. He didn't get arrested. He avoided responsibility that day for having done what he did to Nicole. Responsibility is an important word. Isn't that one of the words we teach I know I teach my kids about responsibility. You know? You have to tell them. You have to let your kids know, hey, you do an act, you got to accept responsibility. Okay? You got to accept the consequences. Well, he didn't accept the consequences that day. He didn't accept responsibility. He jumped in that Bentley. He drove away. He snuck off. He avoided responsibility. He got away from the police. They tried to catch him. They couldn't. Well, we caught him this time. Well, after the defendant got away, Edwards asked Nicole to go down to Parker Center, to come from Rockingham all the way downtown to Parker Center so that he could have some professional photographs taken of her injuries. But she refused. You remember what she said? She said, no, I just want my children. I want to stay here with my children. I don't want to leave my children. And she was beaten, and she was bruised, and she was hurt. She still wanted to stay with her kids. She wanted to be with her kids. And Edwards said, well, will you do this for us? Will you just go down to West LA Station and let us photograph your injuries? It'll only take a few minutes. It seems as if she was more concerned about her kids than she was doing anything to the defendant. She didn't care about documenting her own injuries at that time. She just wanted to be with her kids. But Edwards took her to West LA Station and he took some Polaroid photographs of her. Do you remember those photographs? Back in February, I think it was. I think I marked those people's 4 and 5. I want you to go back for a moment with me 8 months ago. Take a look at these injuries. And keep in mind that these are Polaroids and they're 8 years old. But look at these injuries. And just look at what you can see, which isn't much at this point. See the small cut to the right side, where we are on the right side of her upper lip. Look at the swelling on her left cheek. Look at the scar, the scratch, the bruise up on the right side of her forehead. You see that? You've seen other pictures of her. You saw a picture of her when she was alive and smiling. Remember that picture? I'll have to find it for you tomorrow. But you look at that picture, the one you're looking at now, and you look at the one of her smiling. And you look at those two pictures, I think, and it helps you discern just how badly bruised she was. At some point, he took her back home to be with her kids. The defendant, well, they didn't catch him that night. And the next day, Nicole spoke to Ron Shook. And the next day as well, the defendant spoke to Detective Farrell. Remember Detective Farrell, the detective investigating this case? He called Detective Farrell on the phone and apologized for the incident and expressed to Detective Farrell his dismay at the extent of her injuries. Do you remember that? He called Farrell and told him he didn't realize she'd been injured that much. He didn't realize the full extent of her injuries at the time. I don't know, you tell me. That's a Polaroid. This is People's 29. You She doesn't quite look like that in any other photograph that you've seen in this case, does she? The fuse was burning, ladies and gentlemen. He had injured her, he had harmed her, and he had beaten her, and he did not fully realize the extent of his own anger, the extent of his own rage at that point. He had hurt her in ways that he himself, didn't fully comprehend at the time. And later on, he wrote her some letters. He was trying to get back on her good side. Now, you may see these as letters of apology. We say these are letters of manipulation. What is he really attempting to accomplish here? You'll have the original letters in the jury room. In the beginning, he expresses to her how sorry he is. Actually, I don't know, does he say he's sorry? Does he say he was wrong? But he says he was wrong for hurting her and that there's no excuse for what he did. And then he goes on to write something I think is very, very important here. He writes that he's thinking and trying to realize how he got so crazy. He had such emotional feelings towards her that were as high as any he'd ever felt. And it must be because of those feelings that he reacted so emotionally. With all of that emotion running in him, he says he didn't react too well. It's just as I said a moment before. He doesn't fully realize, or he didn't in 1989, just how crazy he could get, how emotional he could get, how passionate he could get. Now, what set this whole thing off? What happened in 1989 that caused him to get to the point that he beat this woman up? Well, Ron Shipp testified about his conversation with Nicole. Now, if you reflect back for a moment on the defendant's statement to Edwards that he had two women, right? What did Shipp tell you about his conversation with Nicole? She found out about the other two women. She didn't want to have sex with them. She didn't want to be with them. That's what led to this whole thing in 1989. It's passion. It's emotion. And when that passion and that emotion gets out of control, and he was out of control in 1989, and when that fuse starts burning, ladies and gentlemen, and it starts getting shorter and shorter, it sets him off. He was set off that day in 1989. But you look at this letter, and you have this letter in the jury room, and you'll see that he can't always control the passion and anger and the emotion himself. Something about this woman, she does something to this man that causes him to lose control. And he lost control. He lost control of her because in 1992 she moved out of his house. In January of 1992, as I recall, and the next month, I think it's February, I don't know. Maybe I should pull out that timeline board, Jonathan. Because in 1992, in February, if I'm not mistaken, she filed for divorce. Well, you know, when a woman moves out of your house and files for divorce, I have learned, it means she doesn't want you anymore. It means that there's something wrong in the relationship. And it means, I think, that perhaps if you are the other party to that marriage, that perhaps you should be seeking companionship elsewhere. Now, that's not what they did in this case. She left. She filed for divorce. And he couldn't take it. You heard from Catherine Bowe and her husband, Mr. Colby. Remember Mr. Colby? They lived at the corner on Gretna Green. In 1992, and I believe it was April 28th, around 11 p.m. at night. It's here on the chart. They looked out the window and they saw a figure, a man in the dark. In the darkness, they saw a man, and the man was out on the sidewalk, and he was looking around, and he was pacing a little bit up and down the sidewalk. He was pacing, walking up and down on the sidewalk. I don't know what it means when people pace. I do it a lot, but I don't know what this person was doing, pacing out there on the sidewalk, but they thought this was unusual at 11 o'clock at night. Was it a Sunday night? I think it was a Sunday night. And they watched this person. This man, by the way, this man was about 6 feet, 6'2", 200 pounds, African American. They watched this man in the dark, in the night, pacing up and down the sidewalk. And then they saw that man walk down the sidewalk, up the driveway, and peer through the window of Nicole Brown's house on Gretna Green. You remember that testimony? He didn't handle that divorce, the filing of that divorce too well, now did he? Now they may say, oh, well, he looked through a window. Big deal. This is more than just looking through a window. This is stalking. When people come up to your window at 11 o'clock at night and they peek through it and they look through it and they watch you, there's something wrong here. There is something wrong here. This is obsessive conduct, ladies and gentlemen. This is obsessive conduct. This is stalking. And the Colbys saw this man. They saw him do that. They saw him walk back out on the sidewalk, and they became so concerned about him that they telephoned the police. They called the police. And after they called the police, they continued to watch through their window, to watch this man. They couldn't tell who the man was at that particular point in time, but after a few moments, they could. Who was that man? Him. It was the defendant. O.J. Simpson, stalking Nicole. It's already April. April of 1992. And let me tell you something. By April of 1992, this woman knew that she was going to die. She told Edwards that he was going to kill her. She told him that back in 1989. And apparently she believed that. You heard testimony from a DA investigator in this case, my investigator from my office, Mike Stevens. And Mr. Stevens testified that in December of 1994, and with the permission of a judge, he said that he went to a bank and he drilled a hole in a safe deposit box. You recall that testimony? And it was in that safe deposit box that he found the letter that we showed you a moment ago. Remember that? The letter where the defendant says he doesn't know how he got so crazy. They found that letter. And they found two other letters from the defendant, from O.J. Simpson, to Nicole, attempting to get back with her, attempting to convince her to take him back, attempting to convince her that things would be better the next time. They found those letters in that safe deposit box, and they found something else. They found a will. They found a will. This woman's will. It had been executed during 1990, which means she must have been about 30 years old. Do you know many people at the age of 30 who execute wills? But you find her will, his letters, and something else. Do you have one? There were some photographs from back in 1989. Because after he beat her in 1989, she called her sister Denise, and Denise came over, and she showed Denise the injuries that this man inflicted on her, and she asked Denise to take pictures of those injuries. And she put those pictures in that safe deposit box, along with her will, along with her letters. Okay? She put those things there for a reason. I mean, they're just letters, and they're just pictures, aren't they? But if you're going to have a safe deposit box, you think that the things that you put in that box are the things that you think are important. Now, I don't know how you want to interpret that conduct. You can interpret it any way you want, but let me suggest to you that you should interpret it this way. She is leaving you a roadmap to let you know who it is who will eventually kill her. She knew in 1989. She knew it. And she wants you to know it. She knew who was going to do it to her, but she didn't know when. But whenever that eventuality came, she wanted you to know who did it. Think about that. Just think about that. A will, photographs of her being beaten. Okay. You tell me. One of the photographs here that Denise took of her sister. Wait. One of the photographs that Denise took of her sister in 1989. People's 11.
Thank you.
And this photograph was taken, as I recall, on the 3rd or the 4th, I believe, of January, 3 or 4 days after the beating. And you can still see the injuries. Okay. This wasn't some little bruise that healed overnight or that went away the next morning. She left these for you. This is a roadmap. This is a sign. She wanted you to know who killed her when the time came. But it's 1992. And in 1992, he has already beaten up her Mercedes in her car. He has already beaten her up. Show the next one. And he is peeping through her window. Now look at the picture up on the album. Look at People's 29. That fuse is getting shorter, folks. It's burning. And at some point, he is going to explode. But in April of 92, as he peeps through the window and stalks her, he is jealous. He is jealous. He is consumed with jealousy. He has become obsessive. And we know he's consumed with jealousy because we know that back in 1989, after he did this to her, he spoke to Ron Shipp. Remember that? You remember Ron Shipp. You remember what they did to Ron Shipp on the witness stand? Ron Shipp testified that back in 89, he was a member of the LAPD and a friend to Nicole and to the defendant. And that after he beat her in 1989, she called him. She asked him to come and see her, and he did. And you recall his testimony when he walked through the door, he saw Nicole and he saw these injuries and these bruises, and he was shocked. And he wanted to know who did this to her, and she told him. He did it. And she talked to Ron Shipp about the defendant's conduct and their relationship. And as you recall, Ron Shipp at the time was teaching at the police academy. He was teaching a course on spousal abuse. And he showed Nicole a document. And this document listed some of the characteristics that are indicative of a man who beats women and are indicative of a woman who allows a man to beat her. And he showed it to Nicole, and he spoke with her, and she asked him to do her a favor, and that is to speak to O.J. Simpson, her husband at the time, the defendant, to speak with him about his conduct, to speak with him about what he did to her. And Ron Shipp did that, and he showed this document to O.J. Simpson, the defendant. The document, I believe, was called a profile, a batterer's profile. It listed all these characteristics consistent with a person who beats his wife, and he showed them to O.J. Simpson, and they had a discussion. And at first, this defendant tried to minimize what he had done to Nicole, and he tried to suggest that, hey, he wasn't a batterer. And Ron said, man, look at your wife. Look at the injuries. Of course you're a batterer. The defendant tried to minimize his conduct. And he showed those characteristics, that profile, to O.J. Simpson. And O.J. Simpson pointed one out. I mean, Shipp said, hey, do any of these fit you in your mind? Do any of these fit you? There's one category entitled pathologically jealous. Remember? And O.J. Simpson said, well, maybe, maybe a little bit. Maybe I'm a little bit jealous. A little bit pathologically jealous. That's one of those things where you can't just be a little bit of. Either you are or you aren't. You know what I mean? I mean, you can't be somewhat jealous or partially jealous. You're either jealous or you're not jealous. And this defendant, he was jealous, and he was out of control, and he was consumed with passion for Nicole, and he was obsessive because in April of 1992, he is peeping through windows. He has already beaten her. He has beaten up her car, and he'd done some other things. In 1988 and 1989, I told you already that the testimony from Denise Brown was that he humiliated Nicole in public by grabbing her crotch in front of a bar full of strangers. And what else had he done? What else had he done? He'd thrown Nicole and Denise out of his house one night. Remember that night? That night that Denise said to him, OJ, you take Nicole for granted. And he blew up. Remember, he blew up and he said, hey, I do everything for her. And he became enraged back then, and he picked Nicole up and he threw her against the wall, and he threw her out the house, and he threw Denise out the house, and he threw all the clothes down the stairs and out the house too. Remember that testimony? This is the private side of him. This is the other side. This is the side of this man that you don't see in the commercial. He is out of control. He cannot handle it. And the fuse is burning.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our, Mr. Wooden, would you take that down for me, please? Thank you, sir. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the evening. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and we'll resume with Mr. Darden's argument tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Have a pleasant evening, what's left of it. We'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. All right, we'll stand in recess.